The air inside Studio 6B was thick with the scent of floor wax and the faint, ozone-heavy hum of dozens of high-definition cameras. For Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, the environment was meant to be a reprieve, a softball interview designed to humanize the complex mechanics of the American economy. She sat in the guest chair, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her posture conveying the quiet, academic authority that had become her trademark. Across from her, Jimmy Fallon was performing a comedic bit about the price of eggs in Manhattan, his voice a warm, rhythmic presence that filled the space between the microphones. The audience was a sea of appreciative shadows, their laughter rising and falling like a tide. It was a perfect scene of media-managed normalcy. But beneath the mahogany desk, the energy was already beginning to shift. Jimmy's laugh didn't die out all at once. It transformed into a quiet, professional smile that remained fixed even as his eyes gained a cold, analytical sharpness. The transition was so subtle that the audience didn't notice the change until the room had already gone cold. Jimmy leaned back, the light catching the silver in his tie, and mentioned a fictional subsidiary called the Aurelius Fund. The name hung in the air like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Yellen didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed by a fraction of a degree, a microscopic tell that only a high-fidelity lens could capture. She began to respond with a rehearsed sentence about liquidity facilities and market resilience, but Jimmy interrupted her, not with a joke, but with a specific date, March 14th. He described a series of ghost transactions that departed from the Federal Reserve's primary server, transfers that didn't appear on any public audit. The narrative of the Aurelius Protocol began to unfold, a fictionalized shadow web of financial maneuvers that operated outside the Treasury's public ledger. Jimmy didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the gentle, rhythmic cadence of a teacher, but the content was a death sentence for a legacy built on transparency. Yellen's polished veneer remained, but a single bead of sweat began to track down her temple, reflecting the studio's overhead grid. She tried to pivot back to inflation targets, her voice remaining calm and measured, but Jimmy was no longer playing the part of the jovial host. He reached under his desk and pulled out a single, unremarkable black tablet. It hadn't been there during the pre-show walkthrough. Jimmy tapped the screen, and a spreadsheet began to scroll, a list of accounts that were unmistakably tied to the fictional Aurelius Fund. The audience went silent, a heavy, oppressive quiet that felt like it was pressing the air out of the room. Yellen looked at the camera, searching for the on-air light, but it seemed to have blurred into a red smear of inevitable consequence. Jimmy asked a question about the Sovereign Bridge, a fictional transit route for untraceable capital moved across international borders. The secretary's defense was a masterpiece of economic jargon, but Jimmy had the logs. He began to read names of fictional offshore banks, names of shell corporations, and the specific digital signatures that authorized the transfers. The room felt smaller. The distance between the host and the guest seemed to evaporate until there was only the evidence and the person who couldn't explain it away. Yellen reached for her water, but her hand stopped halfway, hovering in the air like a broken machine. Jimmy wasn't angry. He was disappointed, a far more terrifying emotion for a public official. He spoke of the betrayal of the public trust, not in a partisan way, but as a narrator reading the final chapter of a structural tragedy. The Aurelius files weren't just documents, they were a roadmap of a fictional conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the global financial system. Yellen's voice finally cracked, a small, jagged sound in the middle of a sentence about fiscal responsibility. She realized then that the studio wasn't a playground, it was a containment zone where the verdict had already been reached. Jimmy produced a photograph, a grainy, high-altitude shot of a meeting at a remote Swiss estate. Yellen was in the frame, standing next to a person whose identity was officially unknown to the State Department. The logic of the secretary's presence there was impossible to justify within the rules of her own public persona. She tried to claim the photo was a digital fabrication, but Jimmy simply flipped the tablet to show the internal Treasury timestamps that tied the image to a secure server inside the department itself. The violation was internal. The room grew colder. The air conditioning hummed with a mechanical indifference. Jimmy sat back, crossing his arms, and watched as the most powerful economist in the world struggled to find a word that didn't sound like a confession. The silence stretched for an eternity in television time. The audience didn't clap, they didn't boo. They simply watched the collapse. Yellen's eyes darted to the wings of the stage, but her staff was nowhere to be seen, replaced by the dark silhouettes of people who didn't work for the Treasury. This was a narrative extraction. Jimmy mentioned the final balance, a fictional document that supposedly listed the ultimate destination of the Aurelius capital. He didn't ask what was in it. He asked why the secretary thought the cameras would never see it. The question was a psychological spear. Yellen's shoulders slumped, just an inch, but it was enough to signal the end of the resistance. She stopped talking. She stopped trying to spin. She just sat there, a person who had managed the wealth of nations, looking at a host who had become her judge. Jimmy looked at the camera and spoke directly to the viewers, his voice a calm, steady narrative force. He told them that the lights were going out on the Treasury secrets, and that the person sitting across from him was the one who pulled the switch. The screen didn't cut to a commercial. It stayed on Yellen's face as she realized that the polished career she had built was dissolving into the static of a late-night reveal. She tried to speak one last time, to offer a clarification, but Jimmy simply held up a hand, a quiet gesture that commanded total silence. The interview was over, but the story was just beginning for the millions of people who would wake up to a different version of the truth. Jimmy stood up, not to shake Yellen's hand, but to walk toward the camera, leaving the secretary sitting in the fading spotlight. The mahogany desk looked like an altar of accountability. The black tablet remained open, glowing with the evidence that couldn't be unshown. The credits didn't roll with the usual upbeat theme music. There was only a low, droning hum that sounded like a vault door closing for the last time. Janet Yellen looked down at her hands, seeing them for the first time as something other than tools of power. She was a character in a story that had outgrown her. The fiction of her authority had been replaced by a reality she couldn't control. As the final light in the studio extinguished, the only thing visible was the faint red recording light of a camera that would never stop watching. The narrative collapse was absolute. The Aurelius ledger had been unsealed, and the Secretary of the Treasury was left behind in the wreckage of her own shadow ledger. The city outside was oblivious. But inside Studio 6B, the world had changed forever. Jimmy's final look into the lens was one of profound cinematic finality, the look of a man who knew exactly how the story ended because he was the one who had written the final page. The truth didn't need to be loud to be devastating. It only needed to be told in the right room at the right time by a man who knew how to wait for the silence. The game was over, and the lights were never coming back on for the person from the Fed. Every decision she had made, every secret she had guarded was now public property. The studio grew darker until only the whites of her eyes were visible, reflecting the ghost of a career that had vanished in a single hour of television. The story of Janet Yellen was no longer being written by the Treasury. It was being told by the world she had tried to watch in secret. And in that realization, the secretary finally found the one thing she had always denied her critics: a moment of pure, unadulterated clarity. The lights were out, and for the first time in her life, Janet Yellen was truly alone in the dark. The silence stretched across the digital landscape, a permanent mark on the history of the Aurelius blackout. As the final broadcast signal flickered and died, the image of the shadow ledger remained, burned into the collective memory of a nation that had just learned the true cost of stability. The fiction had become the only reality left, and the reality was a void. The mahogany desk, once a symbol of late-night entertainment, had become the physical representation of an audit that could not be stopped. Jimmy's voice echoed one last time, not as a comedian, but as a witness. He detailed the specific fictional Account 9 Delta, where the untraceable sovereign debt had been parked, and the audience, even in their silence, seemed to feel the weight of the numbers. Yellen's silence was the loudest part of the broadcast, a quiet admission that the game of shadows had finally run out of corners. The camera slowly panned out, revealing the entire studio, now empty and cold, leaving the two figures as mere silhouettes in a vast, dark cathedral of accountability. The credits were replaced by a rolling list of the fictionalized transactions, a scrolling testament to the end of an era. The broadcast didn't end with a good night, but with the sound of a single heavy door latching shut. The Aurelius files were now open, and the world would never be able to unsee what Jimmy Fallon had brought into the light. The descent was complete. The structure had failed. The lights were out,